It's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Rana Mitter. If you haven't heard of him, I don't know where you've been, but Professor Rana Mitter is professor of China relations at Harvard. Prior to that, he taught at Oxford. And I would very strongly recommend a book of 2013, I think, Professor Mitter, on the Forgotten Ally, China, World War II, which I believe was published in 2013, the year the BRI was launched. And Professor Mitter is a very sought-after commentator on issues of geopolitical significance, but bringing history to bear on all of these things. Professor Mitter, thank you for coming on board, and we are delighted to have you. Over to you. Thank you.
Chandran, thank you very much indeed for that very warm welcome. And hello to everyone, I think, from a whole variety of continents and places today. I'm aware that you've spent most of the day hearing a variety of very expert panelists talking about the BRI in a broader sense, where it's going, how financing is changing, what it means in terms of a whole variety of different economic and geopolitical issues. So I thought the most useful thing I could do was to bring in history a little bit in terms of some of the context, but also flag up what I think are perhaps three areas in the future, perhaps the quite near future into the early 2030s, where I think the question of where the BRI goes will be debated most significantly, both in terms of ways in which it will develop, but also potential obstacles, which I think it's worth us keeping in mind as we close out today's session. Let me say, first of all, Chandran, you were kind enough to mention a book I read or published 10 years ago, which slightly more than 10 years ago, actually, now, I suppose, yes, 2013, 12 years ago, on the history of China in World War II. And I'm particularly put in mind of that because, as many on this call will know, this summer actually, is the 80th anniversary of the ending of World War II in Asia, which included, of course, the Sino-Japanese War, the War of Resistance, as it's known in China, as a very important constituent part, along with the Pacific War, which tends to be perhaps a little bit more familiar in the Western imagination. The reason I bring that up at the start, apart, of course, from the issues of the anniversary, which I think are worth remembering, and indeed, if you don't know the history, I'd encourage you to read widely and find out about it, but also because it's a reminder of something a little disturbing, but worth remembering so that we can avoid, I think, what would be one of the great disasters, which is that wartime history was a time when Asia was not at peace. And because Asia has been essentially, at least in international terms, a pretty peaceful continent overall, really since 1979, the Sino-Vietnamese War was the last international conflict that really operated across borders in this region. Because of that, we have maybe come to believe that it's the natural state of Asia to be simply a place that's automatically peaceful. And we look at Ukraine, we look at the Middle East and think, well, goodness me, it's great that that's not happening in Asia. But there's nothing natural about that. It is something that has to be thought about carefully, and structures and geopolitics and geoeconomics have to come together in a way that maintains that peace in Asia. So I think that's a very important collective task. And it's not just a task for Asians. It is a task for the whole world, not least because Asia is, and I think will continue to be economically, one of the most vibrant and dynamic parts of the globe, therefore central to debates about what happens to BRI and other economic groupings that exist in the region. But peace, I would say, is a really important prerequisite in terms of how that future is likely to unfold. So remembering that very turbulent, warlike past that Asia has had, certainly just about within living memory when we think about World War II, is a salutary reminder that the situation we have today is not a given. It needs to be thought about, it needs to be nurtured, it needs to be curated. So bearing that in mind, let me bring in one other historical element that I'd like to bear in mind in terms of the context of how we might think about the BRI and the story of the Global South, which has been so much, I know, thread through what you've been talking about today, and which will continue, of course, to be an absolutely central part to these debates for years, possibly decades to come. And that's the question of the history of energy. Now, you could actually argue that in part, World War II in Asia was, amongst other things, a war that broke out because of energy supplies. And I'm thinking here of the embargo the United States placed on the imperial Japanese state, which wanted oil and other resources from various parts of Asia, was prevented by the United States action from getting them, and eventually launched Pearl Harbor. Now, I hope we're a very, very long way away from those horrific events, but it's worth remembering that energy supply and its consequences do have a history. Perhaps in a less confrontational way, it's worth remembering that a significant part of the history of the post-war period was also tied up with energy. For a very long time, the question of who had control over the world's most powerful source of grounding for energy, in other words, in the Middle East, was an absolutely central part of geopolitics. Of course, the religious, political, and other conflicts that roiled the Middle East, continue to do so, of course, over decades, have a great deal to do with religion, with politics, with nationalism, but they also had to do with energy. And remembering that debates over oil prices and the question of supply from the Middle East, which are not absent today, was central to the politics of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, is a reminder that something that often seems in the background actually has to be thought of in the foreground. It even infects, perhaps infects is not the right word, but it even informs, perhaps is the better way to put it, informs moral narrative. Think back to the 1980s when there was a contrast perhaps with automobiles made in Europe or in the West in general, which were considered to be gas guzzling, as opposed to the Japanese models which were coming onto the market, which had a much more frugal use of gasoline, petrol, fossil fuels. And again, even those terms guzzling versus frugal have a sort of moral weight attached to them, reminding us that even when we talk about seemingly economic issues such as energy supply, moral issues and values are never far away from how they're defined. So that leads me to make a few comments about the way in which I see perhaps some of the key issues that will shape some of these debates and more in the next few years. And as I say, I mean by that into the 2030s, and I think possibly even beyond. And energy certainly sits at the heart of those, but it's not the only one. So thinking about BRI, which of course in some ways is also morphing into the wider GDI, the Global Development Initiative. We don't yet know enough about quite where that's going, but we'll be no doubt learning more in the near future. And tying that up to the bigger story that's run, I know, through today, which is how the economies of Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America are growing, developing, and finding voices of their own, which are not simply going to be dominated by the desires of today's superpowers, whether military or economic, the United States, the European Union, and of course, China, with India, of course, also playing an intriguing role in this new global order. I think these big states will be very important, but they're not, I think, going to be dominant in terms of global South language and discourses. There's a lot more agency, particularly in the many countries of the global South, which have their own emerging middle classes. They have their own developing industries, service sectors, and also wider visions of how they want societies to be, which are not simply shaped by what Beijing wants, what Washington wants, or indeed what Brussels wants. So what are some of the underpinnings that I think the BRI will become part of the debate on? Indeed, it's already part of the debate, but will be part of a developing and changing debate. Well, let's start with energy for the first one. And again, you've heard a great deal about that today, I'm aware. But I think the way in which, particularly in the last half year or so, it does seem that we're moving, at least for the near future, into a world where there's a significant divergence in terms of not just energy supply, but what you might call the philosophy of energy. In other words, a reversion, particularly in the United States, towards pushing to the use of fossil fuel resources. And again, LNG and other factors in terms of global supply are going to be important there, along with a much stronger stress on US fuel self-sufficiency in terms of how the economy is going to develop in the next few years. It leads a dilemma for Europe, of course, which is much less fuel self-sufficient, and the question of what happens in terms of moving past the supply of Russian fossil fuels, something that's unlikely ever to return to the situation it was before the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2014, and then, of course, more full scale in 2022. But also beyond that, the now undoubted leading place that Chinese technology has in terms of key aspects of post-fossil fuel green tech when it comes to energy. Solar panels, of course, being an important part of that, wind turbine technology, and of course nuclear, which still remains a very important element in the way in which that energy story is going to be told in the near future. Now, we'll get in a moment to some other aspects of tech, but as I suspect that probably one of your speakers will have pointed out earlier in the day, and I'll just mention it now, the nature of why hunger for energy will change is already in front of us. And I'm thinking here of the issue of the high energy hunger of the need for big data. In other words, the production of essentially data farms, which are going to draw in huge amounts of demand for energy in shaping AI and the other technologies that already are beginning to change labor markets and economies around the world. So far, there is still only, I think, a relatively patchwork, relatively tentative set of stories around how that energy need is going to be provided and is meaningfully compatible with the reality of the need for post-fossil fuel, climate change-friendly energy technology. Advances are being made, and many of them are, of course, coming from technologies within China, as I think is well known. But that's not the only place, of course, where they're emerging. I've mentioned the continuing and changing role of India in global society, and the question of how far in terms of energy tech India has advantages in terms of production and scalability, I think will become one of the very, very key questions, not right now, but certainly in the near future. And that says something, I think, about the centrality of energy debates that are going to be going on and deepening and broadening in the next few years. So that particular element where right now, in the moment that we're at, China certainly has a leading position in terms of that technology. One of the debates we're going to go through is this now path dependency, or are there other players who are willing to come into that market, put in the R&D, put in the scalability, and make their and produce more of a diversity in terms of the capacity to supply those sorts of goods. One of the things that we do know, I think, still from classic market economics, is that monopoly providers of goods, even if they're public goods, are generally inclined to end up in a monopoly position. Prices raised, or indeed restrictions put forward in terms of the availability of those technologies dependent on political behavior. One of the best pushbacks against the possibility of any country getting that kind of monopoly position is actually for the global system to encourage diversity of production. And while India is by no means the only player, I think it's fair to say that we can look at the importance of it as a potential player amongst others in terms of how that energy story develops. The second factor I want to bring up also links to technology, and that's more to do with comms and technology infrastructure. And right at this moment, as I think is well known, there is a huge advantage that China has in terms of cost, speed, and scalability when it comes to the production of infrastructure that underpins 5G and what comes next, particularly Internet of Things. And of course, the structure, once again, for those fast-changing and not yet fully predictable AI-driven changes that we will expect in the global economy and the emerging economies of the world in the next few years. Again, you'll have had it talked about, I'm sure, during the day, so I don't need to stress the point. But if we think about the way in which e-commerce has been developing, and certainly China in terms of scalability and efficiency is an extraordinary example of how far you can go in a very short time when it comes to e-commerce. And again, think of the B2B type providers who sit in the back rooms in China, who are all part of that wider infrastructure, and something that the wider global economy is still, I think, in the stage of of developing. Certainly what China's managed to do there remains a very important part of understanding how the global economy might develop. But nonetheless, there's still a great deal of transformation. And the key questions which underpin the growth and capacity of communications infrastructure to deal with AI and other developments in the West and the rest of the global South and in China remain partly unanswered. I would say that one of the big unanswered questions, and this is a challenge for China, but it's a challenge for the West as well, and it's a challenge actually for every emerging economy, is AI, at least in the forms that we seem to see it emerging in transforming global economy in the next few years, provides efficiency, it provides scale, it provides all sorts of capacity that simply we couldn't have imagined even a few years ago. But does it provide jobs? Because in the end, one of the great discontents that is happening in economies around the world, you can see it in the United States, you can see it in the industrialized economies of Western Europe, and you can see it in China, where underemployment, the inability of some of the smartest young graduates from Beijing and Shanghai to find jobs that essentially match their talents, the fact that we have, very, very patchy statistics in terms of what's happening in terms of underemployment, again, a sign that all is not well there. These are real factors. And when one asks questions in Beijing, in Washington, in Brussels about what the solution is going to be, quite often the fallback is a highly technocratic one about the way in which AI and other technological capacities are going to change the labor market. But pressing down harder, and again, maybe the Q&A is the place for this, it's often hard to get a straight answer about where exactly these jobs are coming from. In other words, the threat that AI is coming for your job is a real one across the world, whether it's China, whether it's the US, whether it's the EU, and the answers that those who are in charge of the technology, its rollout, and its capacity need to come up with will be a very, very important part of knowing whether populations around the world consider that technological rollout to be an advantage, something that helps to improve societies in the next few years, or whether it's seen as immensely destructive of much of the nature of human civilization. I don't claim to have the answers to these questions, but I think they're important ones to answer, and vague answers that the jobs will come from somewhere, that the fulfillment that human beings need in terms of having that kind of role in society, in which in many cases are being taken away by AI, will be replaced by something else, need more specific and more granular answers than they've been given. Otherwise, the many very turbulent changes in global geopolitics that we can see at the moment are unlikely, I think, to slow down. Let me mention one other turbulence where, again, I think aspects of BRI and its wider economic significance will be important, are in terms of global health. We're now 5 years out from the pandemic, and there is a danger, as the world tends to do, of forgetting an experience that was actually not that long ago, and certainly massively destructive, not just to the global economy, but also, of course, to the normal flourishing of human existence, along with the many millions of deaths around the world that were caused by that pandemic, and forward thinking around how global health will essentially be maintained and developed in a world where emergent middle classes and growing economies will also demand an infrastructure that keeps people not just wealthy, but healthy as well. Pharmaceutical research, life sciences, and the capacity to spread out and bring that sort of technical capability to the wider world is potentially a very valuable contribution that BRI could be part of. And one of the ways in which that happens, and this can be uncomfortable for China, along with other countries, I think, other major countries such as the US, I think, is it involves spreading science elsewhere. In other words, the concentration of scientific capacity, which currently exists in the global north, in China, and a few other places, needs to spread further. We need more science in sub-Saharan Africa. We need more of it of the highest level in Southeast Asia. We need more of it in Latin America. There will still be hubs in those places. Perhaps Brazil comes to mind, Indonesia, Malaysia, and other places. But China and the Western world are going to have to get together and make sure that that scientific capability in areas like life sciences is not hoarded, is not kept, as it were, as the domain or the empire of any one of our leading powers, whether it's Beijing or Washington or Brussels, but rather that the benefits of that type of scientific research are felt more widely because it can be done at a base level around the world and not simply exported with the patents jealously held on to in a way that does not provide that kind of wider capacity for scientific development. That's a challenge, and it's a challenge that, as I say, I think will be hard for some of the major powers to actually embrace, but I think it's necessary in terms of where the next set of challenges lie. I'll use that thought, if I may, to essentially summarize what I think is likely to happen in the near future and where the challenge lies. And then let's have the last few minutes or so for a bit of Q&A, which I'm sure Chandran and others will organize. I think that the Global South, it sounds to me, is a driver of the conversation that you've been having today. And while I haven't been able to hear most of the conference, I've heard some of it. I hope that people will go away with something that strikes me as key, which is that the era in which major powers, the United States, the EU, and China is a major power these days, are essentially in a position to tell others what to do, that needs to be over. And I think that it is steadily becoming a worldview of the past rather than of the future. Instead, learning about genuine partnership. And actually, again, there was a speaker in the previous panel who made a really good point I'd like to repeat, steal, if I may, but with acknowledgement, which is the difference between rhetoric and reality. One of the things that we know is that great powers, the United States, China, the EU, are very good on rhetoric. It's a common fault to all of them, whether it's talking about partnership through strength, whether it's talking about communities of common destiny, whether it's talking about, what it might be a European future, which might be defined as differently from that elsewhere. What I think people want to know is, first of all, how the granular outcome is going to be in all these cases. And secondly, real leaders and real societies understand complexity. They're not afraid of it. What they are afraid of, I think, is people who come bearing saccharine messages, which often hide behind them a much more, how can one put it, less generous reality. I think talking about cooperation is easy. Doing it is hard, but it can be done if it is done in the spirit of sincerity and understanding that both sides have to both take and give. That's a challenge, I think, for a very turbulent global system that we have been moving into for some time and will be with us for some time to come. But there are also indications, not least in terms of how those questions of energy, technology, data, AI may change us in the next few years, that suggests it's a challenge that all societies should be willing to embrace and take up. And I hope very much your conference today has been part of that conversation. It's been a great pleasure to be with you today. And Chandran, if I might hand over to you. We have some time now, for a few comments or questions.
Professor Mitter, that was how to say a whole lot of stuff in 20 minutes. You covered as a masterclass of delivering a worldview with a focus on the whole issue of rising powers, historical perspectives, etc. So I know you've got a bit of a hard stop, and you tell me when you're ready to run away and teach, but I'll ask you a couple of questions that are coming through as well. You touched on energy.
Please.
You touched on energy, and then you said it's going to be more than energy because of the technology issues. Up to 10 years ago, we were told that the world energy needs would increase by 50%, just because of the developing world's needs. And now that we're hearing that data centers might account for 75% of new energy needs, etc. So in that sense, and given the power disparities, and coming back to BRI, I hope it's not an unfair question, What should China, in terms of in its attempt or its desired commitment to global good, do in terms of what the next 10 years should be for the developing countries where the BRI is, given the scenario you've painted, particularly in relation to energy and all the other materials that essentially the new energy matrix will require?
It's a great question, Chandran. Thank you. Now, I would say that one of the things that is, just objectively the case at the moment is that in the vast majority, particularly of the kind of green tech areas, China has a dominant position in terms of the capacity, particularly for solar and wind. So I'm going to give a counterintuitive answer, but I think it's actually one that would work very well for Beijing. Whether or not they would take it is another matter, but I'll give you my thought.
They are listening. They're listening.
Are they? Hi, guys. This is
Yeah.
spread the wealth. I think if you wanted to find a way to actually do what everyone has been talking about for 50 to 60 years and never managed, which is to find a way for India and China to work together, then actually providing the technology and setting up the spreading of the capacity for production of the key elements of green energy tech to India and to other actors in the global south would actually be the most impressive thing that China could do. Now, in one sense, it goes against Chinese instincts because what China's done would say, look, we put all the money and time and R&D for years and years into becoming dominant in this position. Why on earth should we give it away? But actually, one of the principles of economics that's often least appreciated is that actually things are not zero sum. In other words, by China spreading its knowledge and its capacities so that it doesn't have pure and simple control over these technologies, it would actually gain a great deal more cooperation. It would gain competition, which actually would improve quality in China itself. And I think it would do a huge amount of good actually for China's global image. Just because the United States is going through a difficult time at the moment, and I think that's globally felt to be part of the new agenda, doesn't mean that China's reputation has risen. It means that people are willing to hear a story from China, but China so far is still playing a little bit the old playbook of, look, we're here, you come to us, and we control the proprietary stuff, but we'll hand it out to you if we feel that it's in our interest. That's what I meant by the difference between picking up on your other speak between rhetoric and reality. Sometimes the counterintuitive thing to do feels uncomfortable, but it ends up medium to long term with a much, much better result. The United States during the Cold War actually did itself a great deal of good over time by spending and spreading its capacities, often against its own immediate economic and geopolitical interests. It ended up, of course, finding a Cold War outcome that made the United States, at least for a while, a really important actor. I think we're not moving into a new Cold War scenario in that sort of case. I think there's going to be a lot of different multipolar powers that are powerful for quite some time to come. But I think going against its own instincts might actually be more productive for China than it realizes at the moment.
Wonderful. I got another question, but my experience in recent times working with Chinese companies like Huawei, etc., is that they, if I can put it crudely, want to spread the love, and they are not looking at essentially just profiteering. But you are right in saying there is an inbuilt instinct in all societies where people have technology to keep it for themselves and try and profiteer. But I get a sense that might be something different. I hope I'm right. And I think you hope I'm right too, because that's what the world needs. The second question that I wanted to ask you, and I think it's a really important one. I was so glad you mentioned India, and then you hinted at the China-India relations. I was in India in February, and I suggested to some various Indian think tanks I was speaking to that the China-India relationship would probably be the most consequential for the 21st century, thinking outside the box, given the populations and all of that. I got a lot of pushback, and you probably know why, but do you think that is unrealistic to expect? And I know from both sides, there are strong elements believing that it is very important. At this stage, probably India needs a bit, I can't say this, India probably needs China a bit more, but it'd be hugely beneficial. So as a historian, someone looking forward, is that relationship probably the defining relationship without understating the importance of the United States, EU, but in terms of the world and the population, the reality that we're faced with, two countries, about 3 billion people in total, is that the most important? And what should be done?
It's definitely one of the most important, Chandran. I think that that's not in doubt. And if you think about what's similar and different between the two, you can see complementarities. I mean, India still relatively has a quite young demographic, as opposed to China, which now famously is moving into a new phase where the demographic will be older in all sorts of ways. India still, I think, when it comes to the service provision and also an awful lot of the maintenance that goes on around the IT for services has clearly developed into an absolute global player for a variety of reasons, not least concerns about security. Let's be frank about it. There are a lot of players who won't go into China for that particular reason, and that's just, realistic. So all of those things, I think, provide a variety of reasons. I think you're right for the moment in terms of the trade imbalance between the two. It's very much in China's favor at the moment. I think finding areas where it's realistic to find areas of cooperation is really the key thing. Now, we haven't mentioned it, so let's just be upfront about it. The major issue probably continues to be the border dispute in the Himalayas. You speak to people on the Indian side, you speak to people on the Chinese side, and they will both give lengthy and impassioned accounts of why they're exactly right about everything and the other side is wrong about everything else. These are not always very productive conversations. But the wider issue around that is that you have there two of the major economies in not just the region, but the world. The Indian economy, despite drawbacks, for instance, the fact that India is not fully integrated into its region in terms of economics. SAFTA, the South Asia Free Trade Agreements, are not really, I think, very effective because for political reasons, Pakistan and other neighbors are not natural trading partners for India. But nonetheless, there is a wider capacity, I think, in both cases for there to be discussions, as I particularly I'm going to put forward energy again as an area in which clearly there's massive hunger. There's going to be massive needs as those middle classes develop. And to some extent, I think it's almost going to become an unavoidable question, which forces people into thinking how to be more creative about those sorts of issues. So I'd say certainly in the 2030s, stay tuned for some possibly interesting new developments in that particular area. I think we've got time to fit in one more if you'd like to, Chandran.
Yes, thank you. So we had someone from Pakistan and talk and gave us insights that most of us never hear about in terms of the benefits of the BRI, etc. The Chinese BRI in Pakistan raises temperatures in India, as you well know. But so I thought, again, looking into 30 years, Pakistan is a very important country. You know that better than I do in terms of size, scale, and its geopolitical positioning, etc. And as you've said so eloquently, we need peace through development as a prerequisite for stability and development. And it's chicken and egg. You have to have that. So can you just say, what do you think that relationship with China and Pakistan, which is quite strong through a BRI, is essential for Pakistan, which is a very important nation? And then how does China and India and that whole area, which if you put the three countries together, you got 3.3 billion people or something like that by 2050. So I really appreciate your comment on that one.
Sure. So I would give you one particular case study, which I think will be well known to people who know the region, Pakistan and India in particular, which is the Indus Valley Accords, signed in 1960 about the provision of shared use of 6 rivers, essentially divided between the two sides. Until this year, and the recent horrific developments earlier this year between India and Pakistan, perhaps has been the first case when it looks as if that particular agreement may not have stuck, although I think it's still in flux in some ways. The wider history does demonstrate that even through conflicts, wars, and so forth, that particular resource management agreement has stuck between the two sides. And I think that does show that the capacity is there to understand how underlying commonalities mean that there are things that bring people together as well as take them apart. The political division, which everyone on this call is going to know, obviously, from 1947 onwards, have shaped the subcontinent in certain ways that have been vociferous, centripetal, pushing people apart. The underlying ecological and economic logics of the whole of the whole region do point in a very different sort of direction. And as that particular part of history, I mean, it still seems to be in some ways current affairs as much as history, but as the realization that these resource questions will become more urgent, and as you say, as countries like Pakistan, also Bangladesh, which you mentioned on the other side too, one of the largest and fastest growing economies in the world, become more significant players in the most populous region in the world, I think some of those resource questions are going to actually force all sides to get together to come to new sorts of agreements. And China, of course, I imagine will be a very important part of those discussions too. But to some extent, I think what we're talking about here is probably what you might call home business amongst people in the South Asia space as well, with China, of course, an important element of a wider conversation.
Professor Mitter, really, I can't thank you enough. Just 30 minutes, you've enabled us to see things and envision possibilities, threats, etc., and make sense of a very turbulent world, but in which there's a great amount of prospects, and particularly to remind us of the importance of remembering history, and particularly in Asia, not taking things for granted. I come from Southeast Asia, and I always say we've been lucky. 50 years since the Vietnam War, I was born during that period. I grew up always being mindful that we had the domino theory and all of that. We were all frightened that the communists were all coming, and we've had peace, and not to take it for granted. So I would love to engage you more, but I know you've got to run, and we will be back if you will have us invite you again to share your deep insights with all of us. So thank you so much for being with us. And I think on behalf of everyone who stayed on, we're extremely grateful. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, everyone, and have a great end of conference. Bye-bye.
Thank you.